Alright, so today we're talking about Darwin. Okay? So he wrote a book. It's a good book. It's a heavy book. It's the abstract of his larger book he wanted to write. Alright, so let's talk about his biography and some notable events in his life. Okay? So what do I want you to know for the test? Do I want you to know, what age his mother died? No. Okay. That's probably good to know. I messed him up as a kid, but you don't need to know the dates of that. I do want you to know when the origin was published, okay? And then some of the major events, like who's this Wallace guy, why did he matter, that sort of thing. All right. So here's Darwin through time. So you often think of him as, Charles Darwin. He's Charles Darwin. And so this whole development of this man through time. Okay. So his mother died when he was 8. Okay. He started off apprenticing as a doctor. Okay, so like many of you, he was a pre-med. He started med school. Okay. So at age 16, okay, he wasn't exceptional, just the age. Okay. He also began learning taxonomy from John Edmondson, who was a freed slave. Okay, he also knew about taxonomy. Okay. The next thing probably won't happen to many of you, but it might. He did poorly in med school. Okay. And enjoyed. First of all, he couldn't stand the sight of blood, so which is a bad thing for a 19th century doctor. Okay, and also it was about 20 years from anesthesia. Right, so surgery and things like that was not pleasant for anyone. Okay, so you can understand why people might have issues with it. But also, he wasn't a very good student and liked to go off hunting, shooting, collecting beetles. Okay. So he was pulled from med school by his father. Okay. Again, just age 18. Right? So he's already failure at one field. He goes to Christ College, Cambridge for a bachelor's with a plan to become a clergyman. Okay, and at that time in England, it was a very nice life. So you have a little parish, take care of people. Still have lots of time for hunting and shooting and that sort of thing. Okay. Age 19, became friendly with John Henslow, a botany professor. Started becoming more deeply involved in natural history. Okay. And also began to learn geology from Adam Sedgwick. Okay. So at this point, he graduates, and after graduation, he wants to go on a nice, fun trip. So he plans to go to Tenerife with one of his friends. Okay, and note that though he had better proportion before, here's number 10 and 178. So he started doing better in school. All right, so learning taxonomy helps you do better in school. For more of the story. His plans to go to Tenerife fell through, and his friend died. Still 19th century. Okay. So, imagine you in this state. You just graduated from college, you're pretty well in college, planning on to go on to become a minister. You're going to go on this nice break with your friend dies. Okay, what next? Okay. So, Darwin's invited to become due to his friends, Darwin's invited to become a naturalist and a captain's companion on a 2-year voyage. To end up being a 5-year voyage. Right, so imagine being 5 years from home. It's like pigeon letters going back and forth. Okay, and companion is like Doctor Who companion, right? So not sort of romantic involvement or anything, just sort of a buddy to have on the ship. Okay, and why did Fitzjohn, the captain of the Beagle, want a companion? I don't know. So British ships had very strict hierarchy, right? And so the captain couldn't fraternize with the crew really, and he was very worried about depression. And wanted a gentleman to talk to, okay? Because actually in Fitzroy's family was actually a history of depression and suicide, and actually later Fitzroy killed himself. So it was actually a good thing to be worried about. Right? And so by having a gentleman there on the ship, not under his command, he could just have someone to eat meals with and chat with about various things. Okay, so Darwin went there as sort of a naturalist, but wasn't supposed to be a great naturalist. Okay. So here's the route they took. Okay. England, South America, up, Galapagos, around, again. It's a 5-year voyage. And there was a ocean-going voyage. Darwin spent a lot of time on there. Okay. Why did he do this? Yep, Darwin got seasick a lot. So anytime he put to shore, Darwin would love to go on land. They tried to use crossing the ship later. Okay, so they went with gauchos on the plains and watched them catch things, and very sort of adventure Darwin. Okay. So there's a quick video about Darwin's travels in the Galapagos.
On different islands, Galapagos life is taking a different course. As yet, Darwin was unaware of it. But as the Beagle hopped from island to island, he took any opportunity to go ashore. On the island of Floriana, he was met on the beach at Post Office Bay by the governor of the first ever settlement in the Galapagos, an Englishman called Lawson. Lawson's tales of the strange Galapagos life encouraged Darwin to go deep into the interior of the islands. And wherever he went, he collected. He saw the tortoises, though only the domed shelled kind, so didn't see their secret. He saw the little birds with their different beaks, but didn't guess they were all finches. He called one a blackbird, another a wren. There was another bird too, the mockingbird. He'd seen them in South America. But these were somehow different. For now, he had no idea how important that difference would be. As Darwin went further and further into the heart of the islands, he found a...
So, something to think about now. So Darwin wasn't yet thinking about evolution and variation. Okay, so he discovered that on this voyage. He had been thinking about deep time. Okay, so there was a debate in geology at that time in Britain about how old the Earth was. If things happen slowly or through sudden events like a giant flood. Right? So Darwin had one idea of this deep time. Okay, the idea of evolution itself he wasn't really thinking about yet. Okay, and so Darwin's finches not only did not know what groups they were part of, but also when he was shooting them. So we now know there's different finches on different islands. When Darwin shot them, he just recorded them as being in Galapagos. Right? Not which island in the Galapagos they were on. Okay. The GPS wasn't working or something. So, when he went back and figured out there's all this different variation, he had to use someone else's finches from the voyage to figure out which ones came from which island. I guess his records weren't good enough for that. Right? And so while he's voyaging, he's also sending back specimens to England. By the time he got back, he was already pretty famous. He's sending back all these weird giant fossils and all these new plants and animals back to England. Okay? So they weren't all entirely on the ship. He kept shipping them back. Okay? And one thing he discovered with his voyage that you wouldn't discover in just being in one place, why it's important, is variation. Why is variation important for Darwin? Right. Look, animals weren't very variable, right? And Darwin looks at animals varying across space. If they can vary across space, maybe they vary across time. And also while he was in South America, he found giant fossils of mammals that were similar to those that were there now, but they're much smaller now. So we see something similar, but now it seems to have varied through time as well. Okay. And so now we start seeing lots of variation. Okay. And also we know variation is important for natural selection. Right? Why? Right. Definitely. So imagine humans, would be super fit if we had 3 legs, right? So we could run much faster and outrun lions and have more offspring and be wonderful, right? Well, too bad, right? There's no variation as far as I know in humans for having 3 legs. Okay? And so even though there might be adaptive peak over at 3 legs, there's no variation for it. Okay? If things keep reverting to the type, right? So if there were a 3-legged person, but their kids would be 2-legged, right? Because that's what the initial body plan of humans was, then there couldn't be selection, there couldn't be evolution either, right? Getting pulled back to that need. Okay. So Darwin sees this variation, and later he starts looking at doing experiments to figure out if variation is heritable. Okay, showing that it is. So this is why Galapagos' entire voyage to Beagle is so important, is this understanding about variation. Because within a particular place, if you go outside here and look at the birds and animals, you can definitely delineate them into different species. There's very few things here that you have trouble distinguishing between species. If you move, across the continent, you see one species sometimes, varying a bit. Is it 2 species? Is it 1 species? No, okay, no, definitely 2. So you start seeing this variation when you move spatially. It's very important for Darwin to figure that out. Okay. All right, so 22 begins the Beagle Voyage. All right. 27 ends the Beagle Voyage. Okay. And then 28 starts thinking seriously about evolution. Starts keeping evolution notebooks. And what's great now for historians of science, we can go back and see how Darwin's thinking changed through time. Because he recorded all his thoughts. Let's look at his first time he drew a phylogenetic tree. And look and find that tree. Okay. Actually, order a 3D copy of that tree if you wanted to. But you definitely see his thinking evolve through time. Okay, so no. This age 28 is thinking about evolution. Okay. 29 marries his cousin. Okay. If you've heard of Wedgwood China, Wedgwood plates, she's a Wedgwood. So they're loaded. Which is great, because now instead of having to be a clergyman and having to deal with people, he can go retreat to his house and do experiments and start writing. Okay. One thing about Darwin, I think of him as his theorist. He actually did a lot of experiments too. I mean, and very simple sort of middle school science fair experiments, right? So fill your bathtub with seawater, put seeds in there, see it, give it a week, see if they can still germinate. If you give it a month, see if they can still germinate. Right? In order to figure out, could seeds disperse by ocean? Right? So keeping seeds in a bucket of salt water, that's simple. Right? Looking to see how stones in his yard seem to sink into the soil. Right? Because of earthworms sort of eating and depositing, castings on top of the soil. Right? So it's moving up and stuff moves down. Right? Stuff like that. Very simple experiments to understand evolution. Keeping pigeons, right? So people were keeping crazy-looking pigeons evolving very strange pigeons for shows. Right? And so, keeping pigeons and breeding pigeons to understand how that domestic selection worked. Okay? So he's doing all these experiments as well as doing writing and reading. Okay. So, age 30, Darwin's book in the Beagle Voyage appears. Okay, so then the book is worth reading. It's actually a very interesting sort of travel log. It's like Michael Palin visits, the Galapagos and hangs out with gauchos in Argentina. That sort of travel log. It's very interesting. Okay, you can see Darwin talking about, being in a place and having an earthquake, or finding fossils, and things like that. Okay. Okay, so now ages 20 to 50, Darwin keeps churning away thinking about evolution. Okay, and gathering lots of evidence. Okay? So Darwin was a prolific letter writer. Okay, so he'd always be writing letters to people. He actually installed a rear view mirror in his house, so you could see the postman coming up the walk. Right, so he was hitting check mail, and he would check mail to see if the postman was here. Also let him see if visitors were coming, so he'd go hi. He didn't like visitors very much. Okay. So he had people all over the world asking about, not asking about evolution, but asking about certain observations. Right? So asking about, I used to study ants that lived in Mexico. So he'd write a letter to someone in Mexico saying, how these ants, how do these ants behave? Many letters like that. Okay. Continuing other experiments, did work on barnacles and other groups. Okay. Published a book on coral reefs. Okay. Why do we care about that for this class? I don't know. There's many kinds of coral reefs. Okay. So some reefs are fringing reefs. Okay. Right next to land. Some are barrier reefs. Reef comes from the land, and some are atolls that have just water inside this. Yeah. And so Darwin came up with this very elegant idea about how these different kinds of reefs form. And there's all one process. Okay? It's just reefs form wherever the land is the right depth. Okay? Because corals, symbiosis. Most corals have zooxanthellae in them, right? They need light, so that their algae can get light. So you grow to a certain depth. There's a lot of deep water corals that don't do this, but shallow water corals that form reefs require a certain amount of light level. Okay? And so Darwin thought, okay, so what might happen is if we start growing to a certain depth, and then if the island is sinking, we get this kind of view. The island is going up, and this kind of view. And then we look at the world, okay, this figure I believe from Darwin, and you can see areas of the world we have barrier or atolls, and areas of the world we have fringing reefs. Okay. And this corresponds to where the land is going down or up. Okay. So a very simple idea that involves deep time. Right, so a long amount of time for these reefs to slowly grow and the lands to slowly go underwater. Right? So deep time, we can have this very simple idea explain what we see. Any questions about that? Okay. So I've been working on this for 22 years. Right, churning away, writing this long book explaining it. Okay. Talking to just a few trusted friends about his ideas. Okay, I think it's a letter. From this guy named Wallace. Okay. Those of you who are around during the spring, there's going to be a speaker coming and talk about Wallace at Darwin Day. Okay. He's talking about the biography of Wallace. Basically, Wallace is a naturalist like Darwin. He didn't marry a rich cousin. So he's off there working, the working man sort of version of Darwin. Okay, off in the field, getting sick, getting malaria, having his collection burned on a ship. He's had a lot of bad luck. Okay. But while swinging in his hammock sick, over the course of 3 days, figured out natural selection. Okay, and he knew Darwin has some ideas in this area, right? And Darwin was also well connected to British science. He said, "Hey, do me a favor and publish this for me." Okay, so now you're Darwin. What do you do? Okay. So in science, priority matters. Right? It's like Einstein came up with general relativity. Well, I came up with it last week on my own independently, so I'm as smart as Einstein. Well, sure, maybe he came up with it first, so you're just a loser. You could have just read his book, right? So priority matters a lot in science and showing that data is yours and the importance and novelty of it, right? So Darwin has sort of told a few people about this, but he hasn't published anything. It's sitting in his drawer, right? And so Wallace's letter comes, and it has basically all natural selection described very succinctly. So now, what does Darwin do? In the meantime, his daughter's dying. Okay, so he's obviously upset about that too. Right? She's having a very bad week. So what would you do in this case? What's the ethical thing to do as a scientist? We'll get a chance to talk to each other for a minute first. You can try out your ideas. No one's too horrified. Oh, we lost the way. All right, so what would you do?
Publish both at the same time.
Okay, why?
It would, since you have corroborating evidence,
Alright, two people opposite ends of the world come up with the same idea. Okay, that's one idea. What other ideas? Yeah. So collaboration. So how, like, Darwin and Wallace say, or Wallace and Darwin say. Okay. That's what people do. Would anyone sort of lose the letter? Right. But months later. It's not like yeah, whilst nothing in Malaysia at this point. So yeah. And so, I mean, this is sort of, because this is a 150-year-old issue, right? This sort of thing happens in science all the time, even now, right? It's where there's sort of ideas floating around. So, like, one of my earliest papers, published a paper looking at different ways of evolution, and someone else published the same idea in a different journal around the same time, right? They're completely independently of each other, right? But still the same idea. Or use of Bayesian approaches in phylogenetics. Two people publish about the same time, the same idea, independently of each other. And this sort of thing happens a lot in science. Figuring out how to deal with it is important to think about. So what did Darwin do? So he's going to say, okay, just submit it, Wallace letter, and be done with it. I lost. Whoa. But his friends convinced him, no, we should publish both. And so they found some old writing of Darwin's that long predated this, that he first described his ideas. And so I talked about those and other work he had done since then, and presented them both at the same meeting. Okay, that way they both had equal priority. Okay? And so, and Wallace was actually happy with this. So Wallace was happy, Darwin was happy. So you were very Darwinian in your thought. Okay. And then next year, Darwin published this, right? And I mean, this looks like a huge tome, but it actually it's full of information. So, pick a page. Alright, so here's Darwin talking about what organization as a whole. So let's talk about trends, right? So the problem with the organization as a whole has advanced is in many ways excessively intricate. The geological record at times imperfect does not extend far enough back to show with almost equal clearness in the known history of the world that organization is largely advanced. Okay? And so Darwin's talking about, is there a trend for increasing complexity or not? Okay, so this is what we've been talking about in our class. And we'll see what he thinks about that. So I'm talking about highest organisms. Okay? And so any section you get to in this book, there's something that we might talk about in this class on current macroevolution. This is before they knew about genetics. They didn't read numbers. Okay? So it's well worth checking out and reading throughout. Okay? Darwin kept humans out of this. Okay? He comes back to it later and has a book on human evolution. Okay? And writes several books about insectivorous plants. And again, it says, okay, let's try putting, urea, P on plants and see how they react, and other fluids. So he's doing actual naturalistic experiments as well as evolutionary ideas. Okay. Evolution of emotions, orchids, earthworms. Okay. So the other thing with him is looking at evolution is actually looking at all these, how evolution works in various groups and how expression of emotions is similar between humans and apes. All these sort of long-term development processes like earthworms and soil growth. And then, so when Darwin first came out with organism species, it was very controversial. Okay, by the time he was dead, people were really on board with it. So he was buried in Westminster Abbey, as you know, a famous, important British person. Okay, so not much opposition to Darwinism at that point. Okay, and still within science, we quibble about different aspects of the theory. We're talking about levels of selection and that sort of thing, but evolution itself is the underpinning of biology. Yeah.
What was when you first published it? What was the reason behind all the controversy? What were other ideas that people had?
I mean, ideas were about sort of the speed at which things happened, whether all traits were useful, right? So a flower is beautiful. Why did a flower evolve beauty? You can't see beauty, right? So maybe, and so bringing in religious ideas as well, so that sort of thing. But eventually, Darwin went out within science. Okay, and still not getting everything right. And for example, the first origin of species talks about just sort of regular adaptation, not remarking sort of inheritance of acquired traits. Sort of backs off on that a little bit as he revises the additions. Okay, so at the end he starts having a little bit of inheritance of acquired traits too. Okay, which now we don't really think happens, but now with epigenetics, so I'm going back to that view a little bit. Okay, so science is moving on, okay, but Darwin got a lot of it right. So what's the origin of species range like? So here I took this from Wikipedia. This is a good summary. Okay, so the basic argument here. All right, every species is fertile enough that if all its offspring survived to reproduce, the population would grow. Right, fact. Okay, where Darwin gets this idea? We're reading a book for fun by Malthus. Right, so take a break. Read a fun book about economics, and the idea of populations grow. Okay. Another observation. So despite periodic fluctuations, populations remain roughly the same size. Okay. Food's limited, relatively stable as well. Okay. Again, it changes through time, but largely stable. Okay. And thus, a struggle for survival ensues. Okay. So does this all follow? Everyone get this? Right. So if you produce a ton of offspring, not all of them can survive, then there must be some sort of struggle to survive. Okay? And note the struggle need not be, I'm going to eat that meat. Right? It could be, as he says, it could be a plant struggling against the frost or the cold. Right? So it could be maybe interference competition. Okay. Another thing, Darwin's great insight was individuals vary significantly from each other. Okay, which again is a fact. Okay, if you farm, you know this, right? You pick the best cow to breed next year, and that sort of thing. Right? Much of this variation is heritable. Okay, also a fact. And Darwin goes to great lengths to show both of these. Okay. Okay, now an inference. Okay. Those less suited environment, less likely to survive, less likely to reproduce. Those that are more suited, more likely to survive, more likely to reproduce. Okay. If they have heritable traits, those traits that lead to this better reproduction or survival get passed on. Okay. And this slowly results in populations changing productive environment. Okay. So what's missing from this? Darwin, he's right. He's right about many things, but what's missing from this, right? And everything has been staying still in the last 150 years. Right, so the mechanism doesn't have it all. Yeah, good. What else? Yeah. Sure, I mean, this talks about sort of the bias towards getting more adapted, but I don't think he actually talks about, like, sort of, you could have fixation of deleterious traits by chance, and that can happen, you're right. I should check more carefully, but I don't think he talks about that. Yeah, good. What else? Okay, what's the book called? Origin of Species. Actually, that's the short title. The long title is The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. So yeah, Origin of Species works. Okay, yeah, Darwin loves talking along, talking about like headings and things like that. Alright, so Origin of Species. Okay. What's Darwin's idea of origin of species? talk about origin of life, right? You have to go elsewhere. You can look at a puddle that has, but also, the speciation is sort of this differential adaptation. Right? Whereas now I think of speciation a lot of times happening through things like Dubzinski molar compatibilities. I think this sort of happen to rise by chance, not necessarily by selection. Okay, and lack of gene flow being important. So he didn't really have that view of some sort of lack of gene flow to have speciation. So if you have one duck to be clear, one duck to be clear, sort of evolved to both groups. Okay, so that's a speciation he can go with. Yeah.
How do you get to like the last bullet point where he saw populations change to that?
So this is an inference,
Okay.
not an observation, right? But if you have variation within individuals, and some are better fit than better than others, and the population as a whole will have more of those fitter individuals over time. So you tend to move towards that adaptive beat. Good question. Other questions about this? Okay. But, this is a book that was written for the popular press, kept selling out, okay, and really convinced a lot of people, okay, and with later arguments and elaborations, continued to convince people. Okay, it's worth reading. Okay, and here's the closing of the book, okay, the Tangled Bank passage, so if you say anything about the Tangled Bank, they'll all know what you're saying. Nice way of slapping astronomy too. Give you a chance to read it. See Darwin's view of the world. What? Yes. They had big thoughts. That's what's beautiful. So, all of it is going around and around and around the sun. And all this life goes forth. How's it doing it? From famine and death. Right? So all this competition, this famine, things dying, things not having kids, all this stuff leads to this, wonderful array of life. Things crawling through the mud and flying through the air and flowering. Right? And so this is Darwin's sort of first of all, short description of natural selection, and also sort of description of why it's okay. It does, it's a nice example of how theory works in science, right? So, very simple theory, made up of, just a few facts and inferences, right? Then you can go on to explain a great amount of life or some other phenomenon using it. Okay. And again, it's also testable. So you can go off and you can say, okay, let's see if organisms do produce more offspring than can survive. You can go off and test that observation. Say theory predicts X, and you go off and test it. It's a nice thing about evolutionary theory too. Any questions about this? All right.